Joram, Talita Miera, Marie Schmidt, and Catherine Caridas, who all form part of our wonderful team here at Unchained Solutions, inspiring Australian organisations to make an impact on modern slavery. It's a privilege to work with these women who are all passionate about human rights for women and modern slavery. So we're going to kick off today just hearing a little bit more about why our team is passionate about women's rights and what their current commitment is to helping people in modern slavery. And then finally, what we see as a preferred future on this issue. So I think we'll start with you, Katie. Why are you passionate about the issue of modern slavery and human rights, particularly for women?
Well, I guess I think everyone should be passionate about the issue of modern slavery. I think the fact that humans are still being sold as commodities is something that should really horrify all of us. In terms of why I'm passionate about women in this issue is, I guess, because they are affected much more than men. So if you look at the statistics, it's 71% of women and children are the victims of modern slavery. So when you break that down, if you look at the 4 categories of modern slavery, you've got forced labour, forced marriage, forced sexual exploitation, and you got state forced labour. And out of 3 of those 4 categories, women are the majority of the victims. So we sort of have to look at why that's happening. And I think for me, what makes me passionate is that it's a systemic issue. It's social, it's political, it's legal, and it's also to do with the way we run our private sector as well. So that's what makes me really passionate about women's issues in modern slavery. And I'm keen to see what the rest of the team think about that too.
Yeah, what about you, Marie? Why are you passionate about this issue?
I've been working in the for 20 years, and yeah, it's just I started giving my time back, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to take some time off work to actually focus on the issue. And why do I do that? I want to give back. I want to be part. I've always been a feminist. I am a feminist. I've been raised a feminist. I've been raised by very strong women, and I just want to give back. I have some skills that can help, and so yeah, it's I think it's unfair. It's just unfair, and unfair doesn't sit with me.
Yeah. And one of the things I love about working with you, Marie, is that you're bringing all of your business knowledge, all of your procurement history, and bringing that into a space where you're using your existing knowledge and experience to make an impact on modern slavery through Unchained Solutions. So I think that's something that inspires me about you, is that you're bringing in, you know, your 20 years history of business knowledge. And a lot of people will sit at home and think, well, what could I do? I'm just, you know, a businesswoman, or I'm just a baker, or I'm just a mum. What can I do to make an impact on this issue? And so I think the way that you have made an active choice to set aside some of your time to commit to this issue and to provide Unchained Solutions with excellent business and procurement expertise, I think is, you know, it's an inspiration to me, and I'm sure an inspiration to many people on how we can actually take what we have in our hand and use it for the benefit and the good of other people. So just, you know, I'm inspired by you, and I hope other people are inspired by that as well.
Thank you.
So what about you, Toledo? I know for you, the issue of women's rights is a very personal one. Why are you inspired by to help people in modern slavery?
Yeah, so the reason for me, it's a bit different from the other ones, because I'm coming from abusive, so physical and psychological abusive relationship in my past. And so this relationship, I used to hear from my partner that I wasn't smart enough to do even an engineer degree, because he used to say that I wasn't smart enough, or I wasn't smart enough to learn another language like English. And so so for a couple of years, so 7 years in this relationship, I didn't have the freedom to do what I wanted to do. But then I decided to step out from this relationship, come to Australia, learn English, and I'm not doing a degree that I wanted to do, because I am a biologist, but I was working in supply chain environment, and I had a lot of production engineer, and I really wanted to do production engineer in that time, like 15 years ago. But he used to say that I couldn't because I wasn't smart enough. But now I'm doing a PhD in supply chain. And I also changed the topic of my PhD as soon as I've heard, because modern slavery for me is something totally new. And I wasn't aware about this. So I started to fall in love about this issue that I really wanted to help. Listening from Sarah and Stephen a couple of years ago, and I decided to even change the topic of my PhD, because I was researching the technologies in supply chain, but I wanted to give a purpose to my PhD. So now I'm researching the technologies in supply chain to address modern slavery. So the reason for me to not just do whatever I was doing before, I'm now passionate about giving freedom to people, not just women, but as someone that it's faced the abusive relationships before. I really want to help women and people to step out as well as I did a couple of years ago.
Wow, and you're an inspiration to all of us, Toledo, from emerging from that kind of environment to doing what you're doing now, doing a PhD. And for anyone who's ever worked with Toledo, she's our supply chain consultant. And we're all inspired by her incredible intellect, her brains, the way that she's able to take complicated data from supply chains and translate that into meaningful graphics and meaningful dialogue with a client. So there's no doubt about it, Toledo. You're definitely one of the smartest people I've met, and we're inspired by your ability to remove yourself from that situation and to start life afresh. And we're inspired then by your passion to help other people who are in a similar situation of violence and human rights abuse. And one of the things we know about modern slavery is that around 90% of women who are survivors of human trafficking have actually experienced some form of domestic violence already before they were trafficked. It's one of the contributing factors, one of the push factors, if you like, when we're looking at human trafficking. In particular, there's many, many push and pull factors related to how somebody gets trafficked, what makes them vulnerable, and then how they actually find themselves in a position of getting trafficked. And so one of those statistics is that 90% of women who are trafficked into sexual slavery have been victims of domestic violence already, either as a child or in an abusive relationship. And we know that in many cases it's actually a loved one, a partner or a parent or a family member who will then exploit that person into a trafficking environment. And so the issues that you're talking about, Toledo, are very close to home and something that we, are constantly fighting against, not just in the context of modern slavery, but also just in the context of women's rights in general. And voice has been given that to Australian women over the past week. So.
Exactly, and also because sometimes we don't know that we've been abused. I wasn't aware of what is abuse and what is I started this relationship, I was very young, so I wasn't aware about abuse and my rights and anything else. So bringing this awareness to people, it's very like the drive that I have in my heart. It's to bring this awareness as well. It's not just modern slavery, it's women's rights and bringing this information to the people.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and we know a lot of times people that are in situations of violence and modern slavery, they're not aware of their rights and they're not aware of the things that are available to help them. And so that's part of what we are looking at with our partners through Unchained Solutions, is how we can actually educate people on the ground as to what their rights are, what modern slavery looks like, and, you know, what they have the right to in their particular country of origin.
Yeah, I think education is really is critical in that regard. I really like that story that Caddy is telling about how they educated the workers in the factory. And do you want to tell that story, Caddy? You're probably better placed.
On the same page, Marie. I was just about to go there. We'll get to you, Kathy, in a sec to hear your motivation. But I'd love to hear, since we're on the topic, Katie has a brilliant story to share about the power of education on the factory floor. You can tell the story better than we can, Katie, so you take it away.
Absolutely. When I was working in Cambodia, part of the factory that I was working with, we were trying to provide education that was beyond just career progression or career development. So one of the courses that we put on was just to discuss and go into the red flags associated with slavery. So we had a wonderful organization called IJM come in, and they just ran a half-day workshop for us. And it was all run by local people. They talked about the greatest risk factors, different red flags you should be looking for, and different ways you can help, or people you can connect with if you think somebody that you love or someone that you know has been trafficked, has been a victim of human trafficking. So after that event, which was really just half a day of production that we put aside for these people to come in, we had 2 women come forward, and they were fearful that their sisters had been trafficked over the border. And we could work with them and IJM in collaboration. We managed to find those women and bring them back to their families. So that, for me, was just this incredible realization that education can take up such a small amount of time but have such a huge impact, not just on the lives of the people who you're educating, but on the community around them. And we saw that as well when we did maternal health education. We did a first aid course, and just watching how it empowered the women, but also empowered their families as well. So they would share that information with people. We had stories of women who managed to save their nieces from choking and things like that based on courses that were run. So I think, yeah, education is definitely something we take for granted, and something that can really make a huge difference in terms of alleviating risk for modern slavery, but also improving quality of life for people.
And it's so simple.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a take-home message for businesses who are listening today, is that that's one really simple thing that we can start to implement for people in our supply chains. So when we're talking about supply chain management, we're talking about, yes, our procurement practices, we're talking about, the pressures on production and on supply chains. But some of the things that we like to look at Unchained is how we can make an impact on modern slavery. So some of that is looking at the impact in our local environment. So, for example, we're talking to a couple of education institutions, and so their potential for impact, while they are busy looking at their own supply chains and their own procurement policies, some of the areas of impact is they have 50 to 100,000 students on their books. So how can we educate those students here and build awareness of modern slavery? But then when we're talking to companies about what they can do on their factory floors, in their supply chains, one of the most effective tools that they can use in those situations is to look at education and to be educating people around their human rights on those factory floors. And as Katie said, in their case in Cambodia, they set aside half a day of production in order to provide that education. But at least 2 lives were saved because of that. And I'm sure many, many more that we don't know about. So, we want Australian companies to start thinking about, the problem doesn't have to be so huge and unmanageable. There are things that we can do now while we're still working on our procurement practices and everything else, which can actually have a long-lasting impact as well. I'm going to flick down to you, Kathy, because you've been sitting there quietly. I would love to hear from you why you're passionate about this issue and the issue of modern slavery and women and human rights.
Sure. Look, to start with a little bit, hello everybody. a little bit like Talita, I wasn't already aware of the whole issue of modern slavery probably until about 6 years ago. And I was searching through TED Talks and found one on the link between poverty and injustice, given by Gary Haugen from IJM. And, you know, at that time it was, you know, I still assumed that modern slavery was, you know, dead and back in the 1800s. So I really wasn't aware of this. And to find out that over 40 million people are in slavery today was a huge wake-up call for me. As Katie said, the majority of those are women and girls. And so it really was a bit of a brain shift for me. So that really started on my journey to know more about modern slavery. It's all very well to be aware of it, but you need to get more I guess, absorbed into it. I read books like Not for Sale by David Batstone, and just realised the extent of modern slavery in the world today. So, you know, I went from a place of ignorance or naivety into understanding that this was a real issue in our world today. And so I guess as time went on, I became associated with organisations who were interested in combating and abolition of slavery. So I started to understand what that looked like. And then I had the privilege of meeting amazing and inspiring survivors. And I think that's probably where the tipping point came for me. They were mainly women, but people who'd been rescued out of bonded labour, bonded slavery over in South Asia when I went on a field trip there. We met a beautiful lady, Pachayamal, who had been working in a rock quarry. This lady is now is not only a community leader over in her area, but has gone to the US and is now part of an organisation called the Global Bonded Labourers Association. She is having a huge impact as a woman in her community to rescue people, to give women a voice, to give survivors of slavery a voice. And, you know, meeting inspiring people like that and realising that the journey they've been on, you can only just sit back and, I guess, you know, I just don't know how I would have survived that. You know, the privilege of being born in Australia, being brought up in Australia, having a great education, having a house to live in, to have a toilet and running water in our house. You know, you have to sit back and think, you know, what these women are going through. So, you know, I also met, you know, a lady who came out of slavery, domestic slavery here in Australia. And so I still know her well today. And that is an inspiring story, you know. So I think what it did for me is it became more personal. And so you want to do something about it. You want to say, well, look, this is not the way life should be for all of those men, women and children who are held in slavery. So, you know, that's where I guess I started investigating and trying to meet up with organisations like IJM and Unchained, who were really interested in doing something and having an impact, cultural change at the end of the day on modern slavery. So that's a little background how I became passionate about it.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy. And again, one of the things that inspires me about you is similar to Marie, is that you've got a lifetime of business experience, particularly in the financial sector, and you've committed your time to us as our financial advisor and business advisors. So, you know, again, you know, for people who are wondering how they can get involved, what can they do about the issue? It's about using the experience that's in your hands and finding a way to help people through that. And yeah, I guess my passion for modern slavery comes from working with survivors of human trafficking in a safe house in Spain. And similar to you, Kathy, once I've met people who had survived these terrible tragedies and these terrible traumas. And again, I thought to myself, well, what would I have done if that were me? What would I have done if my family had betrayed me and I ended up in another country that I didn't speak the language, I didn't even know where I was? And particularly for me, it became personal, working in that safe house and meeting survivors. And there was one particular girl called Joy who really had a lasting impact on me. And mainly because she was a 19-year-old Nigerian girl. She came to live with us at the safe house after working on the streets as a prostitute in the south of Spain, and was offered the opportunity for an education. She was illiterate. When she first of all got offered a job in Europe, she thought, well, what kind of a job would I have? I can't read or write, but she thought she'd be looking after children or cleaning a hotel. And instead, she found herself exploited on the streets of Spain. And so when she came to us, she was offered, somewhere to live. She was offered an education. She was offered the opportunity to have freedom from that situation. But unfortunately for her family was still waiting for money back in Nigeria. And so that was her first question when she came to the safe house. Well, how am I going to get money? How am I going to earn money to send back to my family? And in the end, sadly, Joy was actually re-trafficked out of our care. And one day she disappeared from the safe house and we didn't know what had happened to her until a few weeks later when she called and said, that she was in trouble and could we help her? But unfortunately, at that point, it would have put the risk was too high to expose the safe house and all the other women. And so unfortunately, we had to let Joy go. And for me, that story, it was a failure from our part, our failure to provide care for her, a failure to provide for the things that she needed. But I guess it's Joy's story that really drives me to want to make a difference to modern slavery. I've brought Joy home with me in my heart. And, when Stephen and I came back from Spain, we thought to ourselves, well, what can we do with this experience and the research that Stephen had done on his doctorate in modern slavery? And so that's why we formed Unchained, really, was with people like Joy in mind, because we know the realities of modern slavery. We know the vulnerabilities of these women and their human rights abuse that they suffer. And so the objective of Unchained is the end goal is to help people like Joy to find freedom and meaningful employment. And so that's why we partner with the Freedom Business Alliance as well to create meaningful employment opportunities for women on the ground so that they can actually still get an income but be free from their slavery situations. So I'd love to hear from all of you around what your current commitment is. We've heard about your passion and the driving factors for you and some of your stories, but what are your current commitments to seeing modern slavery? What does that look like for you? How do you actually practically implement in your life fighting against modern slavery? Because I think it looks different for all of us. And again, we want to inspire people who are listening that it's about doing what you have with what you've got, and a very little can go a long way. So Katie, maybe you can share with us what you're doing and maybe just a little bit more of your background on how you ended up working with Unchained and what you were doing before that.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, definitely. So before I was working with Unchained, I was working with a company called Outland Denim. We were a social enterprise, so it's still set up in Cambodia, but it's an Australian company. And the sole purpose for the company being created was to provide women who'd come from backgrounds of trafficking safe jobs and an opportunity to progress with their careers. So the founder had really noticed that while there was a lot of organizations on the ground who were doing wonderful work rescuing and restoring relationships and women who had gone through serious trauma, there wasn't that next step, that next job that they needed to come out from a situation of dependency and be able to live independently and start working towards whatever their aspirations were. So we created denim products, premium denim products, and we tried to look at how we could I guess, revolutionize the fashion industry to be something that's empowering, because at the moment, unfortunately, it's an industry that is often full of exploitation. So we were sort of seeing if there was a way we could take an industry and turn it into something that empowered people, especially people who were vulnerable to modern slavery or just vulnerable to exploitation in general, and see what effect that would have on the community there. So I spent 3 years working within that factory, and in that time, I was just blown away, I think, by the women who I worked with. They were absolutely inspirational. They've come through some hugely traumatic things, but their ability just to approach challenges with resilience and a smile just astounded me every day. So I think for me, that is my driving factor, looking back at watching those women sort of come from a difficult position and really embrace the new direction that they were heading in and the freedom that they got. And then after we finished up our time in Cambodia, I came home. I was still obviously very passionate about seeing that progress made within the private sector, because while I feel like certainly we can't eradicate modern slavery without cross-sector help, we need governments to be changing laws, we need deeply sexist social norms to change. But I think the private sector can do a lot to drive change and alleviate a lot of the vulnerability that people are suffering from at the moment in developing countries. So working with Unchained is hugely exciting for me. And when the opportunity came up, I leapt at it, because I just think the way that we can look into our supply chains and start to take responsibility for the things that are happening with the creation of our products is not just about getting that ethical stamp on our business. It's really about changing people's lives on the ground. And having worked in a factory and seen that if you pay a living wage, if you're invested in your staff, cross-training them, educating them, providing an environment that's free of sexual harassment and intimidation, that is the first step in empowerment. And that's what I want to see Australian businesses feel empowered that they can do as well. So
brilliant. And yeah, Katie, it's inspiring to work with you, and always fantastic to have your perspective on the team, because I think what you really bring to us is that end goal of, you know, sustainable factories where people are treated with dignity and respect, where people are paid a living wage. And so, you know, it's easy in business to get just bogged down in, you know, in the compliance factors, in the day-to-day. You know, we're helping companies to ultimately comply with the Modern Slavery Act. And so it can become, you know, we just get bogged down in the data, and we get bogged down in the procurement processes and things like that. But I think what you always bring us back to, Katie, is this is the people that we're serving, this is the people that it's about, and what the impact of that actually is on the factory floor. And so we're so inspired and grateful for your contribution as our COO, and just the depth of understanding that you bring into Unchained in terms of the way that we can help Australian businesses both improve their procurement practices, but also remember the people on the ground that it's actually impacting. So it's always good to have that perspective and the reality check to bring that back in when we get bogged down in compliance issues. So that's one of the main takeaways that we want to take for Australian companies, is that Unchained Solutions is about leading beyond compliance. So we're not just about helping you tick the boxes to write a good modern slavery statement, although that is also key. But what we want you to do is to lead beyond compliance. So again, look at your spheres of influence, both here in Australia and in your supply chains, and go beyond what you need to do in order to just comply with the Modern Slavery Act. What about you, Marie? What does your current commitment look like, and how are you making an impact on modern slavery? No sound.
Better?
Yeah.
When I came to work with Unchained, it was actually an introduction to you through a procurement colleague of mine, and I just decided to work 4 days a week, and I was wondering what I could do with that extra day, and I was looking at doing something, giving back to society. And so, and I thought, well, that extra day a week, I can work with Unchained, and that's my commitment, working with Unchained and bringing my capabilities in supply chain and procurement to support organization in Australia fighting modern slavery. So that's my commitment, but also always keeping it simple.
Yeah.
My commitment is always keep it simple. It doesn't need to be complicated. You can have a huge impact without having to put in place complex processes or activities. It can be, as we were saying earlier, it can be as simple as education, and little counts. So the little that I can give back, I feel great about it. I feel good that I can, after 20 years of working for the dollars, I'm actually working for something that has a purpose.
Wow.
Yeah, that's right, and has a long-lasting impact as well. So, and a lot of people think about, when they think about giving back or they think about volunteerism, they sort of think, well, I have to go and feed the homeless, or I have to do something practical with that time, in terms of actually being in a soup kitchen dishing out soup or something like that. And what I love about you, Marie, is that you actually take your years of experience, which is so valuable to us, and then you bring that into Unchained Solutions, a day a week, and so volunteering looks different. It looks like being a businesswoman in a social enterprise. And so I just encourage people again to just think about what can they use, what's their intellect, what's their capability that they can contribute to a global issue. So what about you, Toledo? What are you bringing, and what's your current commitment to modern slavery?
Well, I'm working in 3 fronts to commit myself to address modern slavery and to help this issue. So the first front is my PhD. So I'm researching technologies to go beyond tier 1, because it's easy to see the risks if it's tier 1, but we know that it's a multi-tier supply chain. So we know that the issues usually beyond tier 1. So working my PhD to find research technologies in logistics and logistics for Industry 4, supply chain 4.0 to address this. So this is the first front that I'm working to committing myself. The second is Unchained. So inspiring business in Australia to go beyond compliance, as you mentioned. So working with you guys, it's a great pleasure for me, and it's a changing life actually. That's why I changed my topic of my PhD. So I'm not, I don't take this for granted, because it's literally changed my life to working with you guys, with Unchained. So meeting people like you guys, it's just changing my whole purpose of life. So my commitment with Unchained is to help with the supply chain, so risk assessment, and with the companies in Australia. And the third front, it's developing a startup. So it's a platform to help education. So it's a startup that we are developing an online platform to help online e-learning. So e-learning courses, then we can to spread the word across the globe. So that's the third front that I am committing myself to address this issue.
Brilliant. Yeah. And what about you, Kathy? What's your commitment to modern slavery?
Well, at this stage of my life, I have the privilege of being a little bit more flexible. So, my support goes to various organisations financially to help support that area of modern slavery, and that's a privilege to get to know these organisations and support through that way. And then also to do what I can, helping Unchained in the business area, giving Stephen support when he needs it, and having those lovely chats about finance and things like that, and recording things in financial statements. But that's my background, and I love being able to do that. But it's also, as I think both Katie and Toledo and everyone's actually talked about, is just education, is actually letting people be aware of the impact of modern slavery and that they can do something about it. It's also about, I guess, getting to think about how they spend their money. There are apps that you can go on to see, who they're spending their money with. What are they buying? Is it a company that hasn't got a very good track record in places like, Colombia or wherever it might be, where they might be using, child labour, where they might be using, even adults in slavery to pick the coffee beans or the cocoa beans or whatever it might be. So I think for me, it's also about just helping people be aware that it's out there and they can have an impact. So I guess it's encouraging people to look past their own self-interest a little bit. And I've got to remember that too. When I go into a shop and look for something, am I looking at, where it's been made, or does that organisation, have a good, strong policy in relation to modern slavery? I've done some research. I've asked companies, what is your policy on modern slavery? And it's heartening to know that people are starting to become more aware. This Modern Slavery Act has raised the bar in people being aware that modern slavery exists. Our next step is to encourage people to make a difference.
Go beyond. I agree, Catherine, to go beyond. It's funny because you say be aware of where you shop. So one of the exercise that I've done for Unchained was to read a number of large supermarkets modern slavery statements, and actually in reading those statements, you can see the ones that are leading with the heart. You can see the one that are really putting people forward. And I actually made a conscious decision to actually change my preferred supermarket on the basis of that. So, and it's about talking to people around you. It's about awareness. Like a lot of people are not aware that modern slavery actually exists in Australia. You were talking about Colombia, but in Australia,
yes,
on our own soil, there are modern slaves. So we really have to spread the word and at least clean our own backyard and do something about our own country, at the bare minimum, make this country slave free.
I mean, I think Unchained were putting on their website, I'm sure they have, is so that people could in Australia look at the various organisations that they go to get support, because you're quite right, there are people in domestic slavery, in bond, sort of in marriage, that marriage situation as well, and there's construction industries where we know that there's slavery happening as well, and agriculture. There's all sorts of industries here, and it's how do they get to know what to do? How do they even aware? I think, as Toledo said, how are you aware that you're actually in being exploited in your environment? So a lot of it's about awareness and raising that awareness for people, and
Yeah, you raised a really important issue there, Kathy and Marie, about when we're talking about modern slavery, we're not just talking about modern slavery out there somewhere. But the current statistics show us that that there are 15,000 people living in slavery-like conditions here in Australia. And we're seeing some of those on the news just this week, 6 women that were kept in sexual slavery, at a house on the North Coast. And, those kind of stories are becoming more and more common. And so we're not just talking about addressing slavery because it exists out there somewhere. But you're exactly right, Marie. We need to look in our own backyard. We need to look at what are our own policies and procedures, and, you know, in our own industries here in Australia, who is actually being impacted by modern slavery. And you're right, Kathy, those details are on our website. So, you know, for people to start educating themselves on, you know, what modern slavery looks like here in Australia and what to do if you suspect somebody is in modern slavery. And so that's part of my commitment here in Australia as a registered nurse, as well as being the director of Unchained Solutions, is actually to be a professional speaker and a nurse leader in that environment. And if you think of how many nurses there are in Australia and where they are, you know, often it'll be nurses who are coming into contact with survivors of modern slavery here in Australia. And so I'm excited about a new partnership developing now to actually reach out to nurses Australia-wide, you know, up to 100,000 nurses in their places of work, to educate them, first of all, what modern slavery is globally, and then what it looks like locally. And I'm also part of an advisory board for some research that's happening in a Sydney hospital, looking at survivors of modern slavery coming through the emergency department and how we can actually identify them and what we can do about that. So there are interesting developments on that front here in Australia.
Sorry to interrupt you.
That's right, you're excited.
but I think that when we talk about the Act, the first step that organizations actually take is to look at their supply chain, but they don't really think about looking at their own operations or their where do they contact with the public, right? A lot of organizations actually contact with the public, and so how do you actually help those people that are in contact recognize the signs of modern slavery? So someone is coming to paint your house, right? And they don't speak the language, and they work at hours that you would not normally work. These are signs. You've got to ask questions. You have to actually talk to these people and try and find out what's going on. Why are they working outside of business hours? Why don't they speak the language? And are they being treated fairly? There's very simple step. It all comes from awareness. It all comes from education.
Exactly.
And it's being in contact with the people that you live around.
Yeah. And part of the thing, I love your rising passion there, Marie. And, you know, and I think all of us start getting passionate as we start talking about this, because this is something that we can do something about today. And that's the take home message. We don't have to wait until the end of the financial year to write a modern slavery statement. It's something that we can all start doing today as consumers, as Australians, as business people. There are things that we can start doing today in order to make a global impact on modern slavery. And, you know, when we're talking to companies, that's the thing that excites me. You know, we were talking to an engineering company, and when they was like, oh, well, we don't have that much in our procurement, you know, line. We don't have that many suppliers. But when we started to kind of brainstorm with them, well, who do you have contact with? What are your areas of influence? Like, we found out that a number of their team actually work on the with the committee that decides the building codes, and they decide which products are actually going to be approved for Australian construction sites. So all of a sudden, there's this massive area of influence. It's like, well, are we going to pick, you know, the products that have slaves in them, or are we going to follow through on our commitment and actually pick the products that are more sustainable? And so all of a sudden, when you take those two individual people from that one company and put them on that committee, which is discussing, you know, codes and construction materials for the whole building industry in Australia, where, you know, that area of influence all of a sudden grows exponentially, to see that, you know, that those construction products can be used on construction sites all over Australia. And so all of a sudden you can see, as we are getting excited, those people getting excited, understanding about, you know, what influence and what power they actually have to make a really massive difference.
That's one of the criteria of the Act. I think the Act is quite clever in the way it's written. There's that requirement to improve year on year on what is it that you're doing, but there's also one of the criteria is, what are your areas of influence, and how can you contribute to fighting, like, outside of what is it that you're doing as a business, right? Like what are your areas of influence to that particular issue?
Exactly right. I'm just going to flick to a question. I'll throw it out there to the whole panel from an audience member. So what role do the panelists see in A, labour inspectorates? It's just there in your chat box if you want to read it. And B, trade unions playing in the eradication of modern slavery. Do the panelists think that awareness and education may even be necessary for unions and labour inspectors regarding modern slavery? So basically, we're looking at so the role, first of all, of labour inspectors and trade unions in eradicating modern slavery, and the need for education for those people.
Absolutely is the answer.
Yes.
Education, education, education.
Yeah. So what about you, Katie? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think the point, especially where we might need to provide education to the trade unions and labour inspectorates, is a really good point. And I think there can be more collaboration there as well, so that we have companies working with the trade unions to sort of work out the best approach so that we can be more effective. But yeah, I think that's a wonderful point.
Yeah. And what's your experience of that in terms of having inspectors come to your factory in Cambodia, Katie? What was your experience of that?
I think, yeah, we certainly talked about this before as a team. I think there were positive aspects of the audit that we went through. But yeah, it's certainly lacking in a lot of ways in terms of showing whether or not you're actually making effective action. A lot of it's looking at your paperwork. It's looking through your pay slips to make sure you're paying the proper amount of money. But there's not a lot of, I guess, emphasis on how things are playing out, whether things are being implemented correctly, whether your team actually have, whether your staff actually have the ability to come forward, that they're well represented, that their concerns are being followed up. So a lot of it ends up being a tick and flick approach at the moment. I think there's so much capacity to be innovative in that area, and to have these different auditors coming in and looking to actually build capacity rather than just to provide a stamp at the end of the day. You're on mute, Sarah.
Sorry. I think that definitely sums up really what we're talking about is, again, education playing a role both here in Australia, again, when we're talking about areas of influence, you know, inspectors going out to building sites here in Australia. I mean, I remember reading one case of Vietnamese, I think 3 Vietnamese men who were working on a building site, and the people there heard that there was an inspector coming that day, and they actually forced the men to stand against a wall and physically brick them into a wall, so that they could hide them on the building site. And it was only that the inspector was doing their job properly, that they walked around, they noticed that the wall was thicker than it should have been, tapped on the wall and found out that there were actually 3 people inside. So that happened here on a construction site in Australia. So that's also education around those people about the, you know, inspections that they do on a day-to-day basis. And how and what to look out for, and then what to do about it when they do find it. So at the moment, the best thing to do when there's a suspicion of modern slavery here in Australia is to call the AFP hotline, the Australian Federal Police hotline, which is on our website. So we've just got a couple of minutes before we wrap up. We'll probably just wrap up about 5 to 12. So I really would love just to hear some final thoughts from all of you around yeah, Stephen's just posted there, our website, unchainedsolutions.com.au. So I'd love your final thoughts just on what is the future that you see in this area? What's your preferred future on this issue? Kathy?
I think awareness. I love that question that that person posted, because let's face it, that whole labour industry is just so at the grassroots of you know, in that construction in a whole lot of areas. So that was a great question. But I think of just, you know, nail parlours, whatever that might be, massage parlours, things like that. I think just awareness. I think making sure that people are aware that slavery exists here in Australia as well as overseas, to be aware of it and to and to ask questions, to be brave enough to ask a question. Go on and find out how to ask those questions and what the sort of questions are, because you certainly don't want to be accusing people of holding people in slavery if they're not. But how do you actually try and identify that someone you meet in the work environment is in a slavery situation? So it's being aware, I think, of that, and not giving up. Keep going, doing whatever we can do, the little small thing that we can do. Just keep doing that, and pray that we can make a big difference in this world.
What about you, Marie? What's your preferred future?
My preferred future is continue to be a good human. And I'll say, what is a good human? Well, it's a person who actually talks to the people around them, right? And it's a person that is part of a society that actually makes the society a good place to live in, and being in slavery isn't good. So so what I'd like to see is people acting like good human beings. That's what I'd like to see, and go beyond that tick and flick exercise. Just go beyond it. It's not about that. What are you effectively doing on the ground? Action. It's about action. I'd like to see action.
Yeah, excellent. Toledo, what about you?
Well, as someone that's passionate about technology and education, can you guys hear me?
Sorry, we might just speak to Katie, Toledo. Sorry. Katie, what's your preferred future?
I think for me, I want to see all women thriving within our globalized economy. So definitely agree with Marie on the action point. I want to see us starting to take some action so that women are empowered, because I think economic empowerment of women is going to be one of the quickest ways we can decrease the prevalence of modern slavery. And that's something that I'm super excited about. So I'd love to see that happening. And I think we in Australia have a role with products we buy, companies we support, and our role within the companies we're working with.
Yeah, that's brilliant. So any final questions, then please put them in the chat box. Otherwise, we're going to wrap up in a minute, and Stephen has a final slide to show. But I just would like to end with, summarising all of those statements. And I think one time somebody said to me a few years ago, well, you can't make a difference on modern slavery. This is a huge global problem. What are you going to do about it? And I thought to myself, well, what if I do this for the next 20 years and we don't make an impact? But you know what? At least I'll know that I've tried. And I think that is important. And I believe that in the things that we've talked about today, in the business solutions, in the way that businesses can look at their spheres of influence, we know that we can make a difference with our partner organisations. We know that people are getting rescued out of slavery every day, and we can address those systemic issues. We can, change the way that we do purchasing. And I really believe that ethical purchasing is the way of the future. As more and more people here in Australia take hold of the Modern Slavery Act, Australia is actually leading the way globally in addressing this issue. And so I'm excited to be an Australian right now. I'm excited to be here, in this place where we can actually have an impact on modern slavery through to making an impact on the ground, as Katie talked about. So we've got a few more questions there from some audience members. So we'll quickly just tackle those, and then we'll wrap up with the final slide. So we've got okay, sorry, I'm just scrolling up there. So just a quick thought on access to justice for victims of modern slavery, I assume here in Australia. It seems as though migration policies and treatment of those in irregular situations may dissuade victims of modern slavery from coming forward for fear of deportation or coming in contact with law enforcement. And then again is a great point. And obviously Australia has a long way to go in the way that we deal with our refugee and migrant policies and the way that we help vulnerable people. But again, that is an area of hope that I've spoken to many police people who have been educated in this area. There's a whole task force within the Australian Border Force now and within police who are trained and educated in these areas. So while, yes, there is a lot more work that can be done, how to shape the narrative on that as part of your question in a more human rights friendly way, definitely. Here in Australia, we have so much. And as Kathy said right at the beginning, from what we have in Australia compared to what other people have in the world, I think we have a responsibility, as one of the leading OECD nations to actually contribute and make a difference in human rights. Obviously, here in Australia, we need to work on that more. But I think we've come a long way just since, Unchained Solutions was founded in 2018. And in the last 3 years, we have seen an incredible difference in terms of, and there's some brilliant organisations doing education amongst law enforcement, amongst health professionals that I'm involved in. And so I think more and more as the awareness grows, as the education grows, that we will continue to find solutions for those people who are survivors of modern slavery here in Australia. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you, participants, for your excellent, insightful questions. We've really enjoyed having you on board today. And thank you to each one of our inspiring panelists, Katie Bajoram, our COO, Talita Miera, our supply chain consultant, Marie Schmidt, our procurement consultant, Kathy Caridas, our financial advisor, and myself, a director of Unchained Solutions, and Stephen, who's the silent partner in the background at the moment, who's the CEO of Unchained, is just going to throw up a final slide with our details of how to contact us. So thank you so much for having us today, and we really encourage you to jump on our website, reach out if you have any more questions, and join our mailing list for future webinars and insights into modern slavery and the Modern Slavery Act. Thank you, everybody. We'll close off there.